Hey guys, welcome back to Your Forest Podcast. I'm Matthew Kristoff. And just a quick couple sponsors. Green Lake Forestry is a sponsor. They are providing resource inventory analysis for the province of Alberta and beyond. And also Damaged Timber. Damaged Timber is a apparel company out of Edmonton. They are supporting conservation and wildlife and environment through the selling of their clothing. So they are going to create a scholarship for renewable resource degrees or diplomas. That'll be accumulated through the sale of their clothing. So 10% of everything they sell is going to go towards this scholarship for people going into environmental sciences. And yeah, they have really awesome stuff. My favorite hat is there. Their t-shirts are really soft and nice. They're very well fitted. Their logo is a caribou hoof with some silhouetted trees and other junk in there. It looks really awesome. Really, really cool. You guys should definitely check them out. You can go to damagedtimber.com to check out, their whole inventory and everything they got going on. So today's podcast is a awesome one. I've been trying to get Ellen Macdonald to come on for a couple months now. I spoke to her at a conference, and she said she showed interest in it. And then she's a very busy person. She's got a lot going on. She is the department chair for the Agriculture, Life, and Environmental Sciences at the University of Alberta. She's a professor there. She has her PhD in forest ecology, and she's really awesome. I actually haven't in one of her classes, but I've heard her speak quite a few times. And she came in to talk about this giant study that's being done in Alberta called the EMEND study. And it is a 100-year-long study, 100 years. Okay, just to study forests and impact of forest harvesting on productivity, erosion, biodiversity, and all kinds of other things. Basically, anything you can think of that would be affected by forest harvesting or disturbance, they're studying it. They want to figure out what's going on and how we're affecting our natural world. Really, really interesting study. So she came on to discuss the biodiversity aspect of it, and she did an excellent job. I really think you guys are going to take a lot away from this. It was really well done. So without any further ado, here is Ellen and I. I just want to start with a hypothetical, I guess. There was a podcast that I listened to earlier a few years ago, and this gentleman had done recordings in the forest. So taking recordings of nature sounds, and you could hear birds and wind and trees and everything kind of moving, right? It was very like your standard sound of nature that people generally listen to and hear. And then he went back post-harvest. So there's a Cutblock. I think it was 5 or 10 years. I forget how much. And he was trying to make a point. He took another recording, and he's like, listen how much less noise there is, how many less birds there are, how many less insects there are, because you could tell a difference, right? And I thought that was a bit disingenuous, because just naturally speaking, you're looking at, so he was in an old growth forest with all kinds of vertical structure and all kinds of options for lots of biodiversity to come in. And then now he's in a brand new Cutblock where there's no vertical structure, very little habitat because it's still new, similar to post-fire or something. And he was saying like, oh, look, we're destroying the forest, right? And that was the kind of gist that I got from it. And I took some offense to that. I was kind of like, well, that's a bit disingenuous to the people who don't know what is going on out there, right? That these are two totally different forests. Of course, they're going to sound different, right? So speaking to that, I wanted to bring you in to talk about biodiversity in relation to the EMEND study, which is a study you've been a part of for, how long has it been going on now? It's been
about 20 years.
Yeah, 20 years. So it's been a long study, and it's going on it's a 100-year study, right?
That's the plan.
Yeah, that's a long time. That's a super comprehensive study. I imagine that there's a lot of people involved in something like that.
Yeah. There's been I don't know how many researchers. Certainly 25 to 30 researchers have been involved in it since it began, and we probably have had somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 graduate students that have completed theses there. And if we look at undergrad students that have worked there, it would be in the hundreds.
Right.
So, yeah.
That's wild. Yeah. Well, just looking at the immensity of it, I mean, you guys do the EMEND talk at different conferences and stuff like that I've been to. And every time I always want to listen to it, because there's always something new to be learned there, and just trying to capture all that information. There's so much going on. So, we can get right into the EMEND, I guess. So could you just explain quickly what the EMEND is, what like the experimental design and kind of what the idea was for EMEND? Do you?
Sure, I can, but could I get back to your podcast you were talking
Sure,
about? Because
absolutely.
I found that really interesting, and I think it can help me illustrate a point, which is about the importance of science and good research in finding out about the impacts we have on our forests and how biodiversity is affected by the way we manage our forests and how forests recover after disturbance. And to answer these really important questions, we need to do good research and we need to do proper science. And, you know, as aesthetically appealing it might be to have these two recordings and make a point about biodiversity in these two forests from these two recordings, that is not science. You know, you could have gone to a different old growth forest down the road 2 days later, and perhaps it would have been very quiet there for some other reason, different time of day, different weather, different whatever. So you can't draw a conclusion from something like that, from two measurements in time. That's called 0 degrees of freedom in science. So you can't. You need to do a proper study, and you need to follow things in a proper experimental way and follow up over time. So that's what we're trying to do with the EMEND experiment. So we had a really ambitious plan in the very first meetings for EMEND were in 1996.
Okay.
And this was a time period when, you know, there was a lot of controversy about forestry, like there still is now, but it was heightened at that time. A lot of concerns about clear-cut harvesting, a lot of concerns that we were managing our forests for one value, which was timber, or maybe timber and some what we call charismatic megafauna. So, you know, things that we like to hunt, or grizzly bears or something like that. And that the whole biodiversity wasn't of concern, or wasn't getting enough attention. And so there was ideas coming out from scientists and managers about different ways to manage the forest. One was the natural disturbance paradigm. So this idea is that forests are resilient to disturbance. You know, most of the forests that we experience in northern parts of the world anyways, experience disturbance all the time. They burn in fires. They have blowdowns with wind. They have insects, and they've gone through these cycles of disturbance over and over and over and over since glaciation. Yeah. And they're resilient. They grow back. They support biodiversity. They support healthy ecological function. So the idea of the natural disturbance paradigm is that if we can make the way we disturb the forest more like a natural disturbance, then we'll do a better job in maintaining all those ecological values that we want from the forest. Right. So that was kind of one idea that was coming out at that time. And then the other idea was sort of the new forestry ideas that were coming out of the Pacific Northwest with people like Jerry Franklin, and all the concerns about loss of old growth forests and spotted owl and protests and anxiety everywhere. Yeah. And those ideas you could distill down pretty basically to the idea that you need to leave something behind. Okay. And this was part of the concern about clear cutting, is that nothing gets left behind, or well, stuff gets left behind, but live trees, some of these really important things that are valued by certain wildlife aren't being left behind when we harvest these forests. And so there was kind of these two ideas. One is to manage more like natural disturbance. The other is to leave things behind that will help the forest recover after the harvesting. And we kind of put those ideas together into the EMEND experiment. So the idea was that how could we put an experiment on the ground that would help answer these questions about how we manage forests in a different way to maintain biodiversity and all the other ecological values, you know, carbon storage and cycling of water and productivity of the forest resource itself, which is what we want and need. Yep. So we came up with this idea to put this experiment on the ground. John Spence from my department at University of Alberta, and Jan Volny, who is a research scientist at Canadian Forest Service, were really the driving force behind it. And they talked to industry partners at Dashawa Marabini and Canfor in the Peace River Grand Prairie area, and said, do we want to do this? And it was a big plan to put this on the ground. And it took probably about a year of discussions to kind of scope out what it might look like and look at some places on the ground. And then in 1997, we started to lay it out on the ground. 1998, we did the pre-harvest sampling of everything. And then the harvesting took place over the winter, 98, 99. And we've been following it since.
Yeah.
So the idea was to harvest at different intensities. Mm-hmm. So leave different amounts of stuff behind, basically.
So back then there wasn't any retention going on, really, not as much.
There was very little retention happening in forestry at that time. There might be some areas that were retained because they were specifically identified as having high wildlife habitat values. They might leave some patches. You know, if you had a mineral lick or something like that, it would be protected. If you had, you know, a large wildlife tree that had a nest of a protected bird species, that would be protected. But in general, there wasn't a lot left behind in harvesting at that time.
Gotcha.
And so we went with this approach. It's called variable retention harvesting. So it's leaving varying amounts of live green trees on the land base. And we decided to do a whole range, go way beyond whatever could maybe be imagined at that time as being commercially or operationally sensible. But we went, okay, you can't answer the question about where some limits are unless you test the whole limits.
Right.
So we put harvesting on the ground where we left what we call the clear cut, but really it's 2% retention.
Okay.
2%, 10%, 20%, 50%, 75%, and then an unharvested control. So we have a really wide range of retention levels.
Everything. So you got almost an intact forest with it a little bit removed. Everything from a cut block with a little bit of intact forest. Yeah.
Exactly. And then so we varied the amount of retention. We varied the pattern of retention. So most of the retention is left just as single trees distributed across the entire area. But we also did leave some patches. So the idea is that, might it be better to leave all the trees compressed in a patch? So we had a couple of patches in each harvest area. Then our idea was to also compare to fire as the natural disturbance analog. And so we had some areas blocked off. And the intention at that time was to do standing timber burns experimentally.
Oh, so you burned in them as well?
Yeah, we burned unharvested forests.
Okay.
Now that didn't turn out as well as we had hoped.
As it does when fire is involved.
As it does. And what we were faced with was is like the Goldilocks thing. It's too hot or too cold. So either it was too wet and the forest wouldn't actually burn if we tried to catch it on fire, or it was too dry and the province was very reluctant to let us light a match to this fire.
Yeah, which is fair. There's resources there.
Yeah, they were afraid that it would escape. Once a fire gets going, there's a substantial risk. So they were afraid it would escape.
Yeah.
Or sometimes it probably would have been fine to burn where we were, but it was a higher fire risk elsewhere in the province. And then all the resources, all the firefighters and the firefighting resources got called away somewhere else in the province.
Right.
So we did get, I think, 4 or 5 standing timber burns.
Unfortunately, but... Okay, there we go. We're still going. So you said 4 or 5 standing timber burns is what you managed to get.
Yeah, 4 or 5 standing timber burns we did manage to get. And so there we can use those as a comparison that's like a wildfire as a comparator to the harvesting treatments. The problem with comparing to wildfire is that you can't get a wildfire that happened in your area at the right time that's easily accessible in the same kind of forest as your experiment. That's nearly impossible to get. So you have to either burn it yourself or make do with something else.
Of course.
Anyways, we got the standing timber burns, and then because we didn't get as many burns as we wanted, we decided to add a burn treatment on top of a harvest.
Oh, okay.
So we took some areas that had been set aside for a standing timber burn, and instead we harvested them to 10% retention and then burned half of them. So it's much easier to burn once it's been harvested down to 10%. You can do a surface burn, a prescribed burn much more easily, and it's much easier to control and whatnot. So we do have the other treatment that we can compare to, which is partially harvested with a burn afterwards.
Right. Yeah.
So we have different levels of retention. We have different patterns of retention. We have low retention with prescribed fire on top of it.
Yeah.
And we have all of those treatments, each of them replicated 3 times. So on 3 completely separate blocks in 4 different forest types.
Okay.
So we wanted to go across the range of natural forest types that you'd get in the boreal mixedwood.
Yeah.
So these vary from a pure conifer forest, so pure spruce forest on one end of the spectrum, to a pure broadleaf forest at the other end. So that's mainly aspen or trembling aspen and balsam poplar.
And everything in between.
And then we have 2 in between. So then we have pure aspen or pure broadleaf. We have broadleaf with spruce in the understory. So this is where there'd be smaller spruces in the understory. Then we have a mixture where it's pretty much 50-50 spruce and aspen together. And then we have pure conifer.
Gotcha. Which is reminiscent of the rest of the boreal forest, right?
Yeah, it's reminiscent of the rest of the boreal forest. And that's the stand types that are being harvested and managed now. Those 4 different composition or 4 different forest types. So we replicated all those treatments on all those forest types 3 times, and that in total results in 100 different experimental harvest blocks.
That's awesome.
And each of those blocks is approximately 10 hectares in size.
Okay.
So we had in total 1,000 hectares that were harvested or treated or set aside in this experiment.
Right.
And they're distributed. They're not side by side, obviously. We had to find them in the forest. So the whole area is 7,400 hectare area, the whole experiment.
That's
so
awesome. That's very comprehensive.
It's a very big experiment, yes.
Yeah. Well, it's needed for something as big as the boreal forest, right? I mean, this is 100-year, it's going through an entire rotation, I imagine, the people studying it, and it's like it hasn't been done before, right? This has got to be like a special thing worldwide for forestry to have.
It is study. Actually, it's I think it is still, and certainly it was at the time that we established it, the largest adaptive forest management experiment in the world.
Right.
And it's certainly the largest still in terms of testing the efficacy of variable retention harvesting.
Right.
So since that time, there have been many different variable retention harvesting experiments established in the world. There's one in Quebec, some in the States, in Scandinavian countries, even in Thailand.
Oh, yeah.
And there was a recent review paper that talked about all these experiments around the world, and EMEND was highlighted as the first and the largest.
Yeah.
So it's been really recognized for that. It was very visionary of John Spence and Jan Volney to say, okay, go bigger, go home. We're going to do this right. And you know, we really depended on our industry and government partners to make that happen. The harvesting supplied all the wood for DMI for an entire year just to harvest the EMEND experiment that year in 98, 99 when the harvesting took place. So they made a huge commitment in terms of, you know, planning, logistics, doing the harvesting, and then subsequently, funding the research and funding a research station there. So this would not have been possible without support from industry, support from the provincial government, federal government, Canadian Forest Service, national funding agencies. It's not a trivial thing to undertake an experiment of this magnitude.
Yeah, no kidding. Lots of partners. Yeah, you need all that industry involvement and everything else just to get things off the ground, I imagine. So yeah, no, that's a huge huge commitment for them to have made, right? So I think everyone appreciates that. That's awesome. So as far as the retention is concerned, I guess you said some of the things that were being measured as far as biodiversity. Like I talked with Vic about they were talking about productivity and soil erosion and some other things that were being studied. So maybe you want to speak to the biodiversity aspect of it and how like maybe the different types of retention. So you had single tree retention, you had patch retention, you had strip cuts, I imagine, right? And maybe you want to discuss just the biodiversity was it insect, beetle, mammal? Is there any mammal biodiversity being studied? Birds? Like
we've done just about everything in varying degrees, things that were appropriate to the scale of the experiment. So it's not really an appropriate scale to study really wide-ranging organisms like grizzly bears or something like that, like really large mammals. although maybe I'll get back to a large mammal of interest in a second here. So, but we started at the most biodiverse groups and some of the ones that are relatively understudied. So we did a lot of invertebrate work, and John Spence and Jan Volney were both entomologists.
Right.
So they were very interested. So they did, moths and butterflies and spiders and ground beetles and other types of beetles and invertebrates,
right,
and all that biodiversity. And that's the hugest group of organisms in terms of the number of species by far in these forests.
And I would imagine they're the most affected by something like a disturbance of some kind, right?
Well, they are very affected because they're very tiny, and they're very sensitive to changes in their habitat. They're very sensitive to changes in microclimates. So if it gets warmer, drier, things like that, they're quite sensitive. So they're very good. Yeah, they're very good in more wind for them to, if they're flying invertebrates, then the change in wind can really influence their ability to disperse around in the forest. So that was one huge group that has received a lot of attention.
Yeah. I imagine they have a big role on the rest of the forest values.
Well, they do. They do. They serve a number of functions. So they're food for other organisms. So for amphibians and birds, they're an important food source. They're an important in terms of nutrient cycling. So the beetles and other microarthropods that are in the soil layer are important in terms of breaking down the organic layer and starting the recycling process. So they're important for that reason. Yeah. They play a lot of really important ecological roles.
Right. So it's a really important one. I think it's a good indicator of biodiversity over these areas, right? Probably the best one. So that's awesome.
Yeah, that's a great one. So and then we looked at plants. Of course, I'm a plant ecologist, so I was primarily involved in the plant work since that time. So, we're obviously looking at trees. There's not very many tree species there. It's kind of boring from a tree biodiversity perspective. The trees we were more interested in how they were growing, how they were regenerating over time. I think Vic talked about that a bit. Yep. So it was the other plants that I was more interested in, which is the ones that grow under the trees on the forest floor. So the shrubs, but the grasses and the forbs and those kind of plants as well. And that's the major component of plant biodiversity is those species. Yeah. And they're massively affected when you change the canopy because they're adapted to grow in certain conditions of humidity and temperature and light, and they're competing with trees for resources. And so there's a community of plants that's very closely aligned with the canopy trees. And so when you change the canopy trees by removing a bunch of them and potentially disturbing the forest floor, they're going to be dramatically affected by that harvesting.
As they would be by a fire or by a windstorm.
Absolutely, as they would be by any disturbance. Yeah.
In a slightly different way, obviously, but it's still, it's relative, I guess. Yeah.
So the ones that I mentioned are the ones that are called vascular plants, so that we're all familiar with, the little flowers that grow in the understory and grasses and shrubs and those kinds of things. But we also looked at bryophytes, which is mosses and liverworts. So people know about moss. There's a huge number of moss species in these forests. They're very diverse in terms of mosses.
I remember trying to learn about mosses in university, actually, at the U of A, and it was trying to tell them apart sometimes, right? They got you like the 7 main ones, right? Like their knight's plume and stair step and that. And then from there, it just goes, you go down the rabbit hole. So,
Yeah, so they're very difficult. They're like invertebrates in a way. Invertebrates, you set your traps out and collect them and then bring them back, and you've got 50,000 little bugs, and then you have to sort them all and figure out what they are. And it's a long, hard job at the microscope. So mosses, bryophytes are much the same way. Mosses and liverworts are much the same way. There's, a handful that you could reliably identify when you're out in the forest, and all the other ones you have to bring them back and look at them under a microscope, key them out, and find out what they are. Yeah. But there's many species. It's close to 300 different species of mosses and liverworts that we have found at the EMEND site.
Just in the EMEND site.
At the EMEND site.
Do you think there's more that you haven't quite hit?
Yeah, there's probably some we haven't hit yet. Yeah. So this was a huge effort to collect these and then to get them, properly sorted and identified afterwards. So I have boxes and boxes and boxes of dried bryophytes in my lab that I have to figure out where I'm going to put them all. Yeah. They're all from EMEND, and now we're all caught up in identifying them all and just publishing that actually.
Well, that's good. I imagine that was a hell of an undertaking.
Yes,
for sure.
that was a huge undertaking. So there was the invertebrates and the plants, which were two huge groups that we did biodiversity on, but then there's other groups that we've been working on. So there was work on songbirds, and some done shortly after the harvesting, and then a master's student just finished up some work on songbirds.
Okay.
We have another student working on birds of prey and owls at EMEND right now. He's just finishing up his master's.
That's an interesting one because I imagine birds of prey might benefit from an opening.
They would because there'll be some small mammals that would be food source for them, but then they need some kind of roosting places and hiding places to go as well. So they need a diversity of habitat types
where the retention comes in there. Yeah,
close to one another. Yeah. And then we have amphibians. So we had a master's student that worked on amphibians. Right. Which there's not very many amphibian species in the boreal forest, but they are very, very sensitive to changes in the forest cover. So they need water bodies, and then they need forest cover, and they need a deep organic layer because they dig under it, and that's where they spend the winter. So they hibernate.
Oh, okay, that's where they do it. For some reason, I thought that they would go like under a pond or something like that in the mud, but they actually go just right in the
they go they go down. They bury themselves down under the organic layer in the soil, and that's where they hibernate over the winter.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, because they need oxygen, right? And so under a pond, I think it'd probably be insufficient oxygen.
I suppose, right? Yeah. Okay. I thought,
and so they need to move back and forth between those habitats. So they need to, they need continuous forest cover or some kind of cover that allows them to move without getting nabbed by somebody that's going to eat them, or without it being too hot and too dry, and they can't regulate their body temperature or their moisture very well. So they're
so probably unlikely to find them in a disturbance area then.
Gotcha. They don't, unless there's some kind of shelter for them. So, and then mammals, we have done some mammals. So I have a doctoral student right now. I'm co-supervising with Scott Nielsen, and she's one of the first ones really to have looked at mammals at EMEND. I think initially we weren't that interested in looking at mammals. There'd been a bunch of work done on small mammals before
in relation to
harvesting and clear cutting. And mostly what we found is that a lot of the small mammals love clear cuts.
Oh yeah.
They'll be really abundant in a clear cut. They like the opening. They like the plant species that are there to eat, and they're quite happy. And so we weren't too worried about them.
Same with ungulates, I would imagine, moose and deer.
Yeah, moose and deer as well. Yeah. They like, they like those openings and the food that they provide. So we weren't that interested in them, or they weren't, our most pressing question that we were concerned in terms of how they would respond. We felt we knew how they would respond. But over the years, in partnership with the public advisory committees of the forestry companies and the local Aboriginal groups, they expressed an interest in what was happening to fur bearers. A certain subset of mammals, and not the small mammals, not the mice and voles, but some of the larger animals. Marten and fisher and weasel and hares as well. So squirrels. Yeah. Okay. So those ones that they were interested in, and, they're interested in them from a consumptive perspective again. They want to be able to trap these animals and value from them. So they were interested in how they were responding.
But also a healthy population that you are able to trap is indicative of a healthy forest. And therefore we want to, if you could say that you can sustainably trap an area, then you can probably assume that you have sustainable population as well, which is a good thing, right?
So So it's an indicator. So the biodiversity that we look at, we're looking at it from two perspectives. One is that it has inherent value. We want to know that those species are out there just because they deserve to be out there.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
But also because they are indicators of how the forest is functioning and what the health of the forest is, if you will. So both of those are reasons to be doing these, sort of really broad biodiversity kind of studies in an experiment like EMEND. So now we have this student that's doing work on the fur bearers, and she's just finishing writing up her thesis now, but she's got some really interesting results. And she did most of her sampling with camera traps.
Okay.
So she puts out remote motion sensor cameras, and then it captures what's going by. And so then you can collect data every day of the year, all year long. You don't have to be out there looking for these guys. She also did track counts and scat counts, counting poop of animals.
Did she relate that to like a forest, like a similar forest pre-harvest as well, or is
she did control forests and then the
as well.
different levels of retention
Perfect.
as well. So she had some different levels of retention.
She's got the
and
relation there.
Control forest as well. Yeah.
Good.
And one thing, just to get back to, the fact that we weren't really looking at large mammals, she does get some data on large mammals because they happen to come by her camera traps.
Of course.
So it was very interesting. Over one winter, she ended up getting about 700 pictures of caribou.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Caribou. That's amazing.
Of caribou. Yeah.
I wouldn't have expected that.
So so we have some very intriguing results about effects of variable retention harvesting on caribou.
Interesting.
Which was completely serendipitous.
Huh.
That,
So is anybody looking into that?
She's going to write it up as part of her thesis.
Okay.
I can tell a funny story because she came back and she went, I didn't get that many pictures of my target species. She had her target species that, she was trying to get pictures of, and she was worried she didn't get enough pictures of them. And I went, well, it's your first year, right? Like you've got, 3 years, you're going to collect data. You get more data every year.
You get better at placement probably.
Yeah, I think you'll be fine. And then she was showing just examples of her pictures at a talk with partners, and these are just some examples of my pictures. Click, 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 click. And they went, wait, go back. What was that? And she went, oh, that was a caribou. And they went, oh, how many pictures of caribou did you get? And she went, oh, I don't know, like maybe 700 or something like that. And they went, what? You failed to mention this? This was very interesting.
Yeah, it's a super sensitive species that we all need data for.
Yeah. So that's kind of just a nice anecdotal story about how when you're doing research somewhere and collecting data, you can find out some cool things that you hadn't anticipated just by chance.
You never know. Yeah.
You never know what you're going to see out there. So
I would love to read that. I'm interested when that comes out. Will that be posted on anywhere?
Yeah. We'll write a note or something about it. Yeah.
Okay.
So, I mean, all the research we do, hers will get written in a thesis, and it will also get published in scientific journals.
Yeah.
But we do series of research notes, or what we call EMEND insight notes.
Yeah, on the
where we
website,
just distill down the information from these different pieces of research into, a 2-page document that has the, the major findings and take homes, and try to apply them to management. So we're trying to, make that transition from the scientific research to what it would mean for management.
Yeah.
So we try and get a product like that out for all the different research papers that students produce or that researchers involved in the project are producing, and they're all freely available. We put them up on the EMEND webpage. So
no, I imagine those are really highly used. That's where I came up with most of my questions for.
Oh, okay.
So that's where it all was. I had some stuff from memory, but most of it was just kind of skimming through the page there. And it's emendproject.com.
EMENDproject.org.
.org. Okay.
Yeah.
There you go. So people want to check that out. They can check that out.
They can check that out, and we try and keep it as up to date as we can.
Right.
Given our budget.
Yeah. Of course. Yeah. Everything's got to stay on budget for sure. Okay. So it seems like you guys got everything. I read you guys also were doing studies on bats.
Yes. There was a guy that from University of Calgary who had some work on bats at the beginning of EMEND. We haven't had any bat work more recently, but we had bats.
All kinds of stuff. Seems like you get
we had mycorrhizal fungi, which are fungi that live in the soil and connect trees together and help them take up nutrients. We've had lots about very small soil organisms, so microarthropods that live in the soil that are important in nutrient cycling. We've had soil bacteria, and soil microorganisms studied, and then hydrology and soils and carbon, and
sounds like it'd be pretty hard to argue that you guys didn't do your due diligence with this one.
We did everything we could think of and we could afford over the years.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. So I guess we can start talking about, maybe we've discussed all the biodiversity that you guys were paying attention to. Maybe we can start talking about the effects of some of these things, whatever one you think is most relevant or most interesting in relation to some of these harvest strategies and in relation to the control forest as well. So what are some of the conclusions you guys came to as far as these factors?
Okay, so I think the most important thing is that the results do differ depending on the group of organisms you're talking about. So not all organisms are going to respond the same, and not all species are going to respond the same. Mm-hmm. So maybe getting back again to your podcast anecdote about the quiet forest after it's clear cut, really that's kind of a myth, because there are lots of species that like young forest or like open forest.
Well, it's part of, like, I was at a talk, the Firestorm book.
Yes.
Yeah. The book came out, Edward Strudzik?
Ed Strudzik, yes.
Strudzik, yes. So I was at that on Friday, and he was discussing how he's an author. He's not a research scientist or anything, but it sounds like from his conclusions and the scientists he has talked to, it seems like it's entirely possible that our forest is much more homogeneous than it was in the past due to suppression of fire and all that. So there's, I mean, the boreal forest, as we know, is it needs disturbance in order to regenerate and have a diversity of ecosystems and habitat, right? So, I think there's a misconception there that people think that the forest is supposed to always be old and tall and ancient, right? But it's not true. It needs to be regenerated and needs to burn, or it needs to be windfall or insect kill or whatever in order to come back with, create new habitat, right? So I think
it's true, and that's especially true of our forest and the boreal forest. There's forests in the world that don't experience those kind of stand replacing disturbances. So if you look at coastal forest, Pacific Northwest forest, tropical rainforest,
right,
they do experience disturbance, but it's at a different scale. So they have small scale disturbances, and they do tend to be continuous, kind of have continuous cover of some large trees at all time, and things are turning over.
Right.
But our forests, the boreal forest all around the world, has evolved in a circumstance where it experiences really major disturbance at relatively frequently. It depends on your concept of how frequent is, maybe on average every 70 to 100 years for the western boreal forest here in Canada. And if we looked at the eastern boreal forest in Canada, it's much wetter, say in Quebec and eastern Ontario.
Right.
It'd be less frequent. And then if we went, around to the other side of the world to Siberia and Eurasia and the Fennoscandian countries, they also have differences in their disturbance regime. But in general, these forests do experience fairly severe or extensive disturbance at a regular interval.
Right.
And so they're adapted to that. And every age and type of forest is going to be good for some species. Some species are going to like that, and some species are not going to do well. Mm-hmm. And
that's just natural.
That's
natural.
That's the way nature is. Yeah. So we do need to have a range of ages and types of forests to support the full range of biodiversity. Mm-hmm. Now, there's been a lot of attention and concern about harvesting forests, because you're taking, an older, mature forest that has certain values and turning it into a younger forest. Mm-hmm. And so the biodiversity is going to be different when you do that. Yeah. And just like it would be different when you burn that forest. Mm-hmm. And the question then is, how do we balance that across the landscape in a way that maintains that full range of biodiversity?
Of course.
So you take an old forest, it's got some features that you can only get with time. Only patience is going to get these things for you. So if you have some old large trees, you cannot magically get an old large tree. You can only get an old large tree by waiting long enough for it to grow big enough and old enough. And, they have dead wood is another really important feature in forests. So many species are dependent on dead wood. Yeah. You can only get dead wood if you had a tree that grew big enough to be a big tree, and then it died and it became a big piece of dead wood. That's the only way you can get that. So those are the kind of the features of these old forests that are genuinely important for certain biodiversity. And those are the things that there's concerns about losing those features.
Right.
Then there's young forests and recently burned forests. Many species are highly dependent on recently burned forest. Mm-hmm. And so we need the whole range of forest types, and we need to make sure that when we're harvesting a forest, that it provides some of that early disturbed forest kind of characteristics that will support those species, but also that it'll be moving on a trajectory back towards the unharvested forest condition.
Of course.
So the disturbance that the forest experiences when we harvest it is really very different than fire.
Totally
You know,
different
in
than fire.
a superficial way, you could say the same, right? The trees are getting removed, but when you
Right.
harvest, you take the trunks of the trees and leave the small stuff behind, and the forest floor is relatively undisturbed.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in a fire, a lot of the forest floor is consumed in the fire, and all the fine material is consumed in the fire,
Yeah.
and the large parts of the trees that, you know, in a harvesting scenario go down the road on a truck are left behind. So
Yeah.
there's really no way that we can harvest a forest to be like a fire.
Right. It's a different
It wouldn't
thing.
make sense.
Yeah, totally
But
different.
there are ways that we can make it more like a fire
Mm-hmm.
in that natural disturbance management paradigm kind of way.
Yeah.
And there are ways that we can learn how what are the features of a forest after it burns that help it on that path to recovery or just to transition to succession towards an old forest condition.
Yeah.
And some of those important things are that stuff is left behind, right? So it's
Yeah.
the stuff gets left behind. So deadwood gets left behind. Not every tree is killed, even in a very severe wildfire.
Yeah,
Not
fire
every
skips.
tree is killed. There's
Yeah.
fire skips. So there's patches of trees that aren't killed. There's
Yeah.
individual trees that aren't killed. There's big trees that are damaged and they'll live for a few years and then they'll die and then they'll fall down and they'll become dead wood.
Yeah.
And all of those things are really important to the recovery of that forest as it goes forward after the fire disturbance.
Mm-hmm.
And so those are the kinds of things that we've learned from fire and can try and apply to management. So that's some of the ideas between retention harvesting. You're leaving some of those things behind,
Yep.
just like fire does, to try and encourage that recovery towards the unharvested or undisturbed forest condition,
Right.
in a way that would be kind of like what would happen naturally after a fire.
Yeah. No, it's a very complicated situation. And I mean, that was something that I parroted a lot in my earlier years when I was still in school about like, oh no, we're mimicking fire, because that's what I heard, right? Oh, it's fire. It's exactly like a fire. And then slowly as time went on, I went into hell attack and that, and I realized like these are nothing like fires. It's a disturbance. The trees are gone, but it's totally different. So, but I think the only way you can come down to figure out what the truth of all these things is by doing a study like EMEND and figuring out where the limits are and what you can achieve through different harvest strategies. So
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah,
No, it's
exactly.
very interesting.
Yeah. So, getting back to this young forest and whether it hosts biodiversity or not, young forests do have a lot of biodiversity. And it's kind of interesting to take a perspective from somewhere else in the world where they've been managing forests for longer. So I always like to go to the Scandinavian countries because they have boreal forests that are very much like ours, and they've been managing them quite efficiently for, a couple of rotations. So a couple
amazing.
hundred years.
Considering they have so much less than we have, right? So everything's probably much more intensive.
Everything's very intensive.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting. 30 years ago, they were probably held up as, the model of good forest management because they were very efficient. They grew their trees very fast.
Yeah.
They tended their stands intensely. They could really produce wood out of those stands.
Mm-hmm.
And so this was a model of how to really manage a forest well, which it was if you were interested in timber.
Right.
But what they've learned is that in that management system, they lost a lot of these ecological values.
Yes.
And so these things that we now can, what I was just mentioning, that we've learned from fire as the things that are important to helping the forest recover, those are the things they've lost from their forest. So a huge proportion of their red listed species or their endangered species are species that are dependent on fire, species that are dependent on dead wood, species that are dependent on broadleaf trees because they've done a very good job of converting their mixed wood forest into pure conifer.
Right.
Because they went, we don't want aspen. We want
more
pine.
marketable species.
Pine or Norway spruce in their case. That's the valuable species. And so those things that they effectively removed from the forest in the interests of increasing the timber efficiency, is now linked to a lot of loss of biodiversity.
That's unfortunate.
So they are going out, in a way that probably would blow the mind of many foresters in Canada, and taking, these beautiful plantations and disturbing them. They're girdling trees so they die.
Really?
They're burning individual trees to get charred wood, to create dead wood, to create fire legacies, to get broadleaf species like aspen back into these forests.
That must cost so much money.
It does cost money, but they're really under pressure from public opinion and just their own genuine desire to ensure that their forest is supporting biodiversity in the way that they want.
Probably scientific scrutiny as well. A lot of people.
Scientific scrutiny as well.
Yeah.
So, they're very interested in, a disturbance type that would also support the early successional species, because they have lost a lot of those as well.
Right. Yeah, it's unfortunate that, and I remember that even in university, people talking about like Europe, they've got the best forest, right? And then as time went on, it was kind of like, oh, well, they were really good at doing what they did, and they did a great job at what they wanted to achieve. But unfortunately, the science hadn't caught up to them to where they were unaware of what they were doing, unintentionally. So now that we know, now we're figuring it out. It's
now,
good to know
we're figuring it out, and they're working on a lot of forest restoration,
right?
Which is trying to get these ecological values back into their forests. And so I think we have a lot to learn. We're ahead of the game in many ways, because we know these things now, and we can manage in a forest that'll prevent us from going down that road.
Yeah.
And I think there's a genuine opportunity to manage our forests in a way that we can, maintain these ecological and biodiversity values that we want, while still getting timber out of the forest.
Yeah.
Because I think that's inevitable. We're gonna, we're a resource hungry species, and we're going to get these resources from somewhere. And if you look at what the alternatives are, in a global perspective, in terms of the environmental impacts and the climate change impacts of alternatives to wood, they're not that good. Forests do grow back. They're very resilient, really.
Yeah.
They've grown back, after many fires of different intensities. They established after glaciation without any help from any human beings.
Yeah.
And they do grow back, and it's a matter of how quickly they grow back, how they will supply the values that are important for their health and also for our needs in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something that I repeat ad nauseum, really, is that timber or wood fiber is one of the truly only renewable resources we have on the planet, next to water, I would argue, like that I know of anyways. Because like you said, right, concrete requires so much, X number of resources, and it can't be replenished once it's removed from once it's mined or whatever minerals they require. It's kind of gone, where it's used up.
Well, when it's done, it'll be a waste problem. So
yeah, right, exactly. And then whereas wood is constantly, it's a cycle similar to water, in that it's constantly, we can rejuvenate it and bring it back, and it gets caught up, the carbon gets caught up in buildings and like that. As long as the buildings don't burn, the carbon isn't released, and there's all kinds of benefits from it. But I'm digressing here, but I think it's super important that we maintain the forest industry in the way that it is, and try and continue to get better. So it's good to hear someone like yourself say that. So perfect. So
I think you asked me back what were the effects of harvesting were on the species, and I digressed long. So
I know it was a good digression.
So the first thing is that the different species like different ages and conditions of forest. So there was differences in responses. Certain species definitely benefited by low retention treatments, whereas others definitely depended on the high retention treatments.
Of course.
Most species, or groups of species, there was a difference between unharvested forest and even 75% retention.
Okay.
That kind of surprised us, because the 75% retention treatment really is just thin strips cut through the forest. So we had a harvesting regime where we went through and had machine corridors that the harvesting equipment operated on, and then they selectively harvested in strips to either side of that machine.
Yeah. But
in the case of 75% retention, once we'd cut those strips, that was 25% of the forest gone. So that was our treatment.
Right.
So it's thin strips of machine corridor with strips of unharvested forest in between. So it was surprising to us that even, that what seems like a relatively minor level of disturbance did affect a lot of species that are dependent on older intact forest.
Okay. So what species would you say, like more vegetation species had or kind of
just pretty much every
Everything?
group, pretty
Okay.
much every group. Yeah, there was some where the control forest and the 75% were not that different, but
Right.
many of them they were, and
Okay.
not massively different, but somewhat different.
There was an effect. Yeah.
And then at the other end of the spectrum, we did find that somewhere between 10% and 20% retention, there seemed to be a substantial difference. So often those two treatments were quite different than one another.
Really? Okay.
As compared to 2% and 10%. So
This is among the variation of different types of retention. Patch and strip.
among the different retention treatments. So between 2% and 10%, there were differences, but often they were minor. And so you kind of go, oh, I left an extra 8% and I didn't gain much. Why do that maybe?
Yeah.
And then between 10% and 20%, there often was a more substantial difference.
Okay.
So there may be some kind of threshold there between 10% and 20%. And then for other groups, it just like the more you left, the more similar it was to the unharvested. So it was basically a line, a linear increase. You leave more and it's more similar to the unharvested.
Right. So in relation to some of the other disturbances that you guys created, some of the fires or other things, how did the disturbance relate? Was it pretty similar?
So in terms of, maybe I'll go to the difference between the dispersed retention and the patch retention.
Okay.
So we haven't actually done a lot of work on the patch retention, but we've had a couple studies. One was on invertebrates, and then my doctoral student looked at the plants. And we did find that the patches did maintain the biotic community of an unharvested forest pretty well, especially considering they were small. Like this was like quarter hectare and 1/8 hectare little patches. So they were really small patches, and some of them blew down afterwards and whatnot. And we were kind of going, oh, probably those patches are pretty useless. But then when we did study them, we did find that they did maintain some of these species that are dependent, are associated with unharvested or undisturbed forest condition.
Okay.
So that was interesting. And what we also found is that they functioned better when they were surrounded by some dispersed retention.
Oh, okay.
So if you have a patch, don't just leave the patch sitting out all by itself in the middle of a clear cut. That's not necessarily going to get you what you want if you're hoping that patch is going to maintain some of these forest dependent species.
Right.
But if you leave that patch with some level of retention, and it could be even a low, 10% retention around that patch, then it might function quite well in terms of maintaining those forest dependent species, or the species that are associated with the unharvested forest condition.
Interesting. Even if it was just single tree retention outside of the patch.
Yeah, even if it's just single tree retention around the patch.
Interesting.
So that provides some kind of protective buffer between that and the clear cut condition.
Right.
And
probably a lot has to do with temperature.
Yeah,
wind
probably temperature, wind, and other species sneaking in there, right? If you have a clear cut, say you have a clear cut that you get a lot of grass on, or some early successional species, fireweed, and these kinds of things that come up in the clear cut, then they're going to sneak into that patch from the edges, right? And if it's a small patch, then they're going to sneak through the whole patch.
Of course.
But if you have some level of retention to kind of
keep
those away a bit from that patch, then that's going to be a good strategy. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. And so then in terms of the prescribed fire, I don't have a lot I can say right now about the prescribed fire on top of the 10% burn. There was one student that did some invertebrate work. And then again, I have a doctoral student that's just writing up her stuff now on the plant component to it. We haven't done the bryophytes in those areas yet. But it does seem that burning these areas after harvesting provides some of that kind of early successional habitat that would normally be associated with a fire. So
Okay.
we did see some of these fire-dependent species, like geranium, for example. So geranium is a species that has seeds that will germinate when they're heated. And then, so you find it a lot in areas that have burned, and then it sheds its seeds, and those seeds can be viable for 100 years.
Oh, really?
And so they'll just sit there in the soil until that site burns again, and then they'll come up again.
Huh.
And we did see some of those species coming up in the areas that were harvested to 10% and then burned. So if you're interested in maintaining some of those fire-dependent species, you maintain them across the landscape in the longer term by burning a little bit here and a little bit there and a little bit there.
So was the burn specifically that helped that, or was it just the mechanical action of the tracks?
No, I think it was the burn, because they weren't found in the other side, which was 10% harvest without the burn.
Okay, so it was because
So
of the burn.
it was the burn treatment. Yeah.
The reason I ask is just because I think people they look at like pine species as a fire dependent species where we can go through and mechanically activate those cones.
Yes, you can. Yeah. I don't know I don't know if you could mechanically activate the seeds of geranium, because it's actually the seed that needs to be heated, and in the case of pine, it's the cone that needs to be heated to open. So that the seeds come out. And so you can open those cones in various ways, even just by having them lying on the ground exposed to the sun. Often can be get them warm enough so that they'll open up, and then it regenerates really nicely after any kind of disturbance where the cones are going to be exposed to enough heat so that they'll open.
Yeah. But the whole thing seems very like so it seems like there's no I guess in your experience, would you say there is anything you could really say that is truly detrimental because of Cutblocks that is caused? Like, what are the problems that you see as far as biodiversity is concerned with Cutblocks in relation to other disturbances?
Well,
that's a broad question. I understand, but
it's
I'm trying to get through this whole thing with. I feel like you're probably better at steering this boat than I am. So
they're different, like the biodiversity that you have on a cutover area is going to be different than you have in an unharvested forest. Just like the biodiversity you have in a fire is going to be different. And the question is about how it's going to recover over time.
Yes.
And it seems that if we leave some things behind, leave some live trees behind, leave dead wood behind, leave some of these legacies, biological or ecological legacies behind, that recovery towards the unharvested condition will be faster. And in general, I think that's what we're desiring. Then you need to kind of scale out across the landscape and go, okay, how much of the landscape are we disturbing by harvesting? How much of the landscape is burning? Yeah. What is natural? How much of the landscape should be in that young condition?
Well, that's the thing, or the burning thing, is that we've been suppressing fire for how long that we don't really know anymore how much of it is burning or should be burning, naturally speaking, right? Because
the question of how much should be burning is really, really difficult. Because we have been suppressing fire. We don't know how much fire we've stopped by suppressing it. We can assume that we've stopped some, but also we still get a lot of really big fires that are burning on the landscape. And so the question is whether our harvesting is an additional landscape disturbance on top of fire, or is it replacing the disturbance of the fire that we stopped?
Supplementary with the fire. Yeah.
Because we suppressed that fire. And so those become really difficult questions. And so I think, in the absence of the ability to answer those really well, we should be thinking about, okay, we're going to harvest these forests. We want to, make them as similar to fire as we can. Of course. But we don't need to make them identical to fire, where they're never going to be identical to fire. No. We're making them similar to fire in a way so that they recover like fire does. Yeah. So we don't want them to go off in some strange direction with very different species, or never go back, never get on that trajectory back towards the unharvested forest or the older forest condition. We want them heading back in that direction.
Okay, so it seems really promising. Then, in your opinion, you'd say that there's nothing truly concerning about about these harvesting strategies? Like, you think that we're moving in a good direction as far as
I think we're moving. I think we're moving in a good direction, and I think there's a lot of buy-in. Of course, there's always trade-offs in terms of economics. If you leave some wood behind, then where are you going to get it elsewhere, or are you just giving that up? And that's an economic reality of running a forestry company.
Yep.
But I think that there's a lot of buy-in on the ground. The public is interested in this.
Mm-hmm.
Foresters are interested in this, whether they're with the government or industry, and they're trying to work together to say, okay, how can we do this in the best possible way to make sure that we don't go down some bad pathway where 50 years from now people will go, well, what are those guys thinking? What have they done to our forests? We're trying to do the best job we can and use a science-based approach to do that, and that's what my job is as a research scientist and a professor, to try and create the knowledge that will help inform better management practices in the future, and convey that knowledge to the undergraduate students in my class and my graduate students and the public, or whoever wants to hear me talk about it. Whoever wants to talk about it, yeah.
Yeah, no, it's awesome. And I think, as you're saying, to having to leave some like wood on the landscape and the economic value of that, and I think the forest profession as a whole is pretty cognizant of the fact that this is a long-term look on things. We have 200-year planning horizons on their forest management plans. So it's one of those things where I think the forest industry is good at understanding that, this is a long-term effect. We're not going to get the wood now and worry about it later. It's a long-term. We want this to continue for everybody. And I think good forest stewardship requires us to do stuff like that, allow retention to stay regardless of whether or not it was merchantable, leave it on the landscape for habitat for whatever, whether it's insects or vascular plants, non-vascular plants, or all that kind of stuff. So I think as a whole, we're getting better at, because of this research, that research like it, that we're getting better at understanding the interrelationship of ecosystems and how it all relates. So I think it seems like we're moving in a good direction, at least in my opinion. I feel like we're definitely getting better at doing everything more sustainably. So yeah, it's awesome. I guess we've been almost an hour here. So if you have any final thoughts, feel free to share them. Or if not, I think you've talked a lot about it, so I wouldn't be offended if you didn't want to finish
well,
off.
Maybe there's just maybe one more story from EMEND of, something that we learned that I think is a nice example of how we're still learning a lot about the forest. Well, there's probably a few stories from EMEND about how we're still learning about our forest. We think we know the boreal forest really well. And we go, you think of the tropical rainforest with all these undiscovered species and whatnot. Well, at EMEND, we've identified 10 new species to science.
Really?
From the work we've done at EMEND. They're all invertebrate species that were previously unknown scientifically.
That's awesome.
So there's unknown biodiversity in the boreal forest too.
Yeah.
And you can only learn about it by studying it. So
a study like this that's so vast and comprehensive, I imagine it's probably not the last. You're only 25 years in.
It's probably nowhere near the last. And we had some really exciting finds with the plants too, particularly the bryophytes. So some species that were, previously they thought the farthest east they went was the Rocky Mountains, and there they are in the EMEND area, and some other major range expansions for species. And I think it's just that they haven't been well enough studied.
Yeah.
So there's lots to still learn about the boreal forest. The other thing that we discovered was about the fire history of the boreal forest, since we were talking about fire and how fires have operated in the boreal. So there was a doctoral student, Colin Bergeron, who decided that he wanted to look at the EMEND landscape prior to harvest and look at the relationship between the ages of the forest, the fire history, and how it related to biodiversity. Kind of just as like, this is the baseline of what these relationships look like. So he did a really comprehensive fire history study in the EMEND area, and what he found was really fascinating, which was that this area seems to be dominated by a mixed fire regime.
Okay.
So a mixed fire regime is a fire regime where there's relatively intense crown fires that we would call stand initiating or stand replenishing kind of fires.
Right, so everything kind of burns. Yeah.
Everything kind of burns, the kind of fires that we hear about in the paper, and
Yeah.
everything's standing dead. Of course, not everything is dead, but
Yeah.
major mortality of the stand and of the trees, and the forest starts again essentially, versus lower intensity fires that would go through just ground fire that would, clear out some of the brush in the understory, kill a few of the larger trees, kill some of the smaller trees,
Yeah.
and provide an opportunity for other things to come in and establish.
Mm-hmm.
And so he found evidence that both of those fire types have been operating over the last few hundred years in this area in northwestern Alberta. And this isn't the way we thought it worked. We thought these areas experienced these intense crown stand replacing fires every 100 years or so, and it starts from scratch. But he found that wasn't the case. And in particular, the forests that are dominated by spruce, these pure conifer forests, really consist of 3 or 4 different cohorts of trees. So they're multi-aged. They're not even-aged forests. They're not forests that all started from a fire 100 or 120 or 150 years ago. They have, the oldest trees in those stands. The oldest tree he got went back to, I think it originated in 1735.
Oh, okay.
So some of these trees are very old. And all or almost all of the pure spruce stands had this multi-cohort structure, which is really not the way we thought these forests functioned.
Yeah.
And so then this kind of brings your thinking around back to, emulating natural disturbance and a disturbance type that emulates fire. And you go, okay, well, harvesting to 2% retention isn't necessarily what like fire does. So maybe a 50% retention actually might be more like fire. And,
or variation.
Economics aside, maybe that kind of multi-cohort management that we really haven't thought a lot about for the boreal might be much closer to nature than we thought.
Yeah.
And we say, oh, okay, what would this look like if we tried to manage our spruce stands as multi-cohort stands? Because that seems to be what they are.
Right.
And it seems like to get those pure conifer forests, that's almost what you need to do. They do not grow back to pure conifer forests over a 100-year time period after fire.
No, it's generally the normal succession of a boreal forest is kind of the aspen or pine takes over as a stand initiation, and then the spruce comes up over time, and as it catches up, it kind of takes over.
And it takes time for that to happen.
That was something Vic was talking about too, is how we got these D-density. We got really, really dense, pure spruce stands at 30 years old. And he's like, that's not really indicative of the natural state of things. So it
doesn't happen naturally.
It is interesting for sure.
So it's just kind of something else that we learned that changed our thinking about how this forest functions, and that we truly can use for management, I think, to go, oh, okay, this is what happens. This is the way these forests regenerate and develop after fire or in a natural fire regime. How can we use that as a model? What would that look like if we tried to manage them that way? Yeah. And I think it's just a nice example of how we learn something. We learn something new about the forest, and then we go, okay, how do we apply this now? Yeah,
I think that's the challenge, right? How do we apply this? Because I think forest companies right now, like it's never been a very lucrative business. It's not like they're making, you know what I mean? Like everything's pretty tight. They try and, so I think their challenge now is to try and figure out how to implement these harvesting strategies while maintaining economic stability, right? So I think that's probably where it's going to take a little bit of time, because you can't expect them just like, hey, now you have to do this. And like, we've never done this before. Like, we're going to go bankrupt and not exist. You need to give us time to adjust. So I think that we're in that adjustment period now where we're starting to see some of that, and it's going to take a little while, especially being forestry. It's a 200-year planning horizon, right? It
Yeah,
takes time.
It'll be a gradual transition, and it's, adapting operations. It's adapting the economic and the business models. It's educating people. It's educating the public as well as to what this is looking like and why it looks like that. Why do we leave stuff behind? Some people look at that and go, "Oh, look, they're just wasting all that wood. It's a bad thing."
Yeah.
Or, you go,
or other people look at to see how ugly that is.
They think it's ugly. There's all kinds of stuff left out there, and say, no, that's got ecological value. And so there's a lot of education, but communication, engagement, and building understanding with different communities.
Isn't it interesting how the answer to every question always comes down to educating the public, regardless of what industry you're in? We have to educate. It's like, well, good luck with that.
Yeah. It sounds so one way. You go, I'm going to educate you. It sounds really negative. I like to think about, okay, I have some knowledge and understanding, and I'd like to share that with you and understand what you're thinking and how, what do you see when you look out there, and why do you think that? And it's more of an engagement. I like to think of it as engagement as opposed to education.
That's a good way to do it. I remember the first time that kind of dawned on me was I was in Marty Lukert's class, we were forest policy, and I can't remember what the subject was, but our conclusion in this group project was like, we need to educate the public. And Marty looks at us and he goes, okay, how are you going to do that? He's like, what makes you think that the public's just going to be educated just like that? Like
they're just going to sit there and let you educate them.
Yeah, they have Instagram and Twitter and Facebook and a million other things going on. They got cat videos to watch. Why are they going to listen to you talk about this stupid bullshit, right? Like I think to another point, you're talking about economic value as well, was I think some people, when they hear you talk about, or not you, but hear us talk about the economics, right? They roll their eyes and go, oh, these like money hungry people, like everything's about economics. But I think it's unrealistic to not understand that in order to make this world works off of that, if it doesn't have monetary value, then it's pretty hard to get people to care, generally speaking, right? Like, I mean, we care about nature and that and the environment and all that, but in order to make, nobody's donating us money so that we can take care of the forest.
I mean, that's our economic system. And, if you don't like our economic system, we can look at a different one. But we have a capitalistic economic system. We have, private enterprise. Their job is to make money for their shareholders. Yeah. And that's the way it works. And we can argue about how much they're allowed to make while, using our resources, because it's the public's resources. And that needs to be a discussion as to what the public is happy with, but in exchange, they get wood products and paper products that they use, and they get jobs and they get tax dollars, which helps maintain our lifestyle. And we have to figure out what the balance is that we're happy to live with. Absolutely.
And that's one of the points I made in one of the first podcasts I had was I don't think you want the government being on the hook for managing forests, right? You want private companies doing it and the government keeping an eye on them, because if you have how many people would lose their mind if all of a sudden, okay, you're going to add another 20 or 35% tax onto your wage so that we can manage the forests. So nobody's going to fly with that, right?
They probably would not be happy about that. Yeah.
So the fact that we can get a private organization to monetize this and take good care of it, and have the government have watch the stewardship and make sure that they're keeping things in line for the public, because it is a public resource. I think that seems like a beautiful system to me. Like having private companies take the bill, but the government's keeping a head on it. So I think we're in a good situation. I think I like the way it's going, and I think that we're moving in the right direction as far as forest management and sustainability. And this was a really good episode. I think people are gonna get a lot about it. So
okay, good.
This is awesome.
Good. I'm glad to talk about it.
Yeah, no, this is perfect. I imagined I could just bring you on and kind of wind you up and let you go. That was my game plan. So
apparently it worked.
Awesome. Thanks a lot. Awesome, guys. Thanks a lot for listening. If you guys have any questions for myself or Ellen, you can reach me at yourforestpodcast@gmail.com, or there's the Facebook group or the Instagram group. I got to get a Twitter. I'll get a Twitter here soon too, so we'll sort that out. You guys can hit at me there as well. So anyways, we'll see you guys next time. Thanks a lot for listening.